Let's take a moment to ask God's blessing in the reading of his word this morning. God of Jesus Christ, give us a spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of Jesus, so that the eyes of our hearts might be opened. Help us to know the hope to which you've called us, the riches of the glorious inheritance you've given us in the saints, and the immeasurable greatness of your power at work within us, through Jesus Christ our Lord, in whose name we pray. Amen. I'm going to turn this morning in God's Word to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 38. And while you're turning there, we'll show it on the screen in just a minute too. But I want to give a little bit of background, first of all, to the sermon series this Advent, and then to the passage that we're going to look at this morning. First of all, the sermon series, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the genealogies in Matthew, and specifically the women whose names are mentioned there and their stories, trying to understand what does this mean for us. I think the reality is that in every one of our families, we have stories in the closet. Maybe stories that we don't pull out very often, but stories that shape us and mold us and make us into who we are. Maybe it's a story of an untimely death of a parent or a grandparent, or a long illness, or an injury, or something that really reshaped family life, and the impact of that was felt for a couple of generations. And I imagine if we went through this room this morning, it wouldn't take very long until we'd find some of those stories here. Maybe even stories you've only heard little strands of, but it shapes who you are today. And in essence, that's what Matthew's telling us with this genealogy. That these are stories that shaped who the Messiah was when he was born into this world, that he was born into the middle of these kinds of stories. And so we're going to try to unpack that, beginning today with the story of Tamar. Now, in Genesis 38, I think there's a couple of pictures that I can show here. This involves Judah, one of the patriarchs, one of the sons of Jacob, and he's moving around a little bit. And so I got this map here so you can see a little bit of where he's moving, and I'm going to move closer so I can see it myself. If you look to where the Dead Sea is, kind of in the center there, you can see it labeled. If you go just about to the left of that, of the center of the Dead Sea, there's a town called Mamre, or Hebron. And that's where Jacob and his 12 sons lived. Now Judah, we're going to read at the beginning of this text, goes away. And he goes just a little bit further. It's actually the next dot to the left. Can you see Mamre? Can we see that there? There we go. You can see Hebron, and he goes just to the left to Adullam, and that's where he settles. Now Adullam is not that far away. It's only about 12 or 15 miles as the crow flies. But as you can see from the topography here, it's on the other side of the ridge. And so Judah is trying to really go far enough away from his family that he's not a part of them anymore. And then he moves around a little bit more. He's going towards Timnah at one point. A key thing in the story happens in Anayim, which is just to the north of Adullam there. And Anayim, what might help you and keep in the back of your mind, the word means eyes. And there's something that Judah is going to see when he gets to Anayim, or as a result of what happens at Anayim. So that's the kind of the lay of the land. Now next we have just a couple of pictures to kind of give you the landscape. This is Adullam. This is where Judah ends up settling, and as you can see, it's a nice place. You could settle in a lot worse places than this. So this is where he's settling. He's got large flocks and herds, and then as he's going along, I'll look at the next picture. This is from one of the towns in the area. You kind of get a sense for the kinds of structures. Obviously, it's all fallen down, but you get a sense for the kinds of structures, at least the construction techniques that he would have seen as he's going through these towns and things are happening at the city gates. So that's our background to Genesis chapter 38. And you've heard a little bit of the story, but now we're going to hear about it from God's word. First of all, the genealogy from Matthew chapter 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And here's Tamar's story. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. Kind of an odd custom. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Onan knew that the child would not be his, so when he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. And so Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he didn't find her. He asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. And Judah said, let her keep what she has, or it will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she's now pregnant. And Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these, she said, and she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them, and he said, she's more righteous than I, since I would not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb, and as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, and so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you broke it out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, it was an act of desperation. I don't think there's really any other way to understand it. By rights, Tamar should have been taken care of. Custom demanded that a widow whose husband died without children should be married to the brother of the deceased until an heir was born who could provide for her. Now, as I mentioned when we were reading the text, it's sort of a strange custom to us, but it was a fairly common custom throughout the ancient Near East. One where it was important for the protection of the family's name and the property, and for the protection of the woman, the care of her, the wife, the mother. You can read about this even in Deuteronomy chapter 25. But for Tamar, that provision never came. Tamar's first husband, had died young and unexpectedly. He was wicked in the Lord's sight, we read in verse 7. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but we can probably guess by reading through the lines that Tamar's first marriage was not a very happy one. But her death left his death left her financially and socially vulnerable, and so for her, probably a marriage to Onan was not the end of the world. But whatever hopes she would have had for a better life would soon have been dashed as Onan turned out to be no better than his elder brother. Again, we don't know much about the marriage except to see the evidence of Onan's selfishness, both as it related to Tamar and it related to his brother in verses 9 and 10. And so Tamar, for the second time, found herself as a young woman, a young widow with an uncertain future. Sure, there's this promise that somewhere down the road, Tamar, you'll be married to Shelah. But that promise was a few years off, and as the years went by, it became clear that Judah didn't really intend to fulfill that promise. He didn't want to offer his youngest son to a woman who, it seemed, had a deadly effect on the members of his family. And so Tamar was stuck. She's stuck, disillusioned, and increasingly desperate. It seems that Judah may, too, have been especially careless. Commentators differ on this a little bit, but by sending her away from his own household, where he should have been the one caring for her, back to her father's house. Although, again, if you're Judah, you can probably imagine that he didn't want to be reminded every day of a promise that he didn't intend to keep. And so 3, 4, 5, we don't know exactly how many years go by, but the years go by. And Shelah clearly is an adult, clearly ready to be married, and it becomes obvious to Tamar that she is going to be destined for a life of childless widowhood unless she does something. And we can only imagine how much the injustice and the unfairness of this all must have grated on her all that time, as she asked perhaps how the God that Judah served could allow this to happen. How could he overlook such callous behavior within his, God's, family? She had to be disillusioned with Judah's family. I mean, who could blame her? Maybe disillusioned with God, wondering how in the world could that God redeem this story, her story. But Tamar in this story is not the only one in need of redemption. The chapter begins by telling us that Judah had moved. Now, that doesn't really strike us as all that unusual or significant to a 21st century American audience where we don't think twice really about moving maybe even halfway across the country for a job. But this is not typical behavior in a culture where family is the most significant tie. And that's what Judah does. He not only leaves his family geographically, but he leaves them culturally. He marries a Canaanite. He hangs out with a Canaanite. They're his friends. They're his associates. They're now his family. And this in a family where Abraham sent his servant all the way, hundreds of miles away, back to family in order to find a wife for his son. And Jacob was sent to that same distant location to find a wife for himself. And now Judah is marrying the neighbors that they didn't want to marry. Nor does Judah stay in one place. We find him not just in Adullam, but later in verse 5 at Kezib, and then in verse 12 at Timnah. Now, maybe for Judah, he would say, this is just an innocent pasturing of my sheep. I mean, after all, sheep wander, they need pasture, they need green grass, and so you got to go where the grass is. But the text seems to be suggesting to us, too, that maybe it's not quite so innocent, that Judah is actually trying to run from something. And if you have your Bibles open, you can flip back just a chapter to chapter 37, and you have a good guess what that something might be. Because in chapter 37, we find that Judah's younger brother, his brother Joseph, with whom there's a rivalry among the brothers, his younger brother Joseph had been sold into slavery. And Judah played a key role in making the decision that that's what they were going to do with him, driving his father to grief. And so we have to ask. We aren't told, but we have to ask. Was it perhaps guilt that drove Judah away? Now, Judah probably would have argued he was just running from his dysfunctional family, and there was plenty of dysfunction to run from. We can read about his oldest brother's sexual escapades at the end of chapter 35. His next two oldest brothers' violence toward their neighbors in chapter 34. There's a bickering that seems to run throughout Jacob's sons on all the accounts of their interactions with each other, reflecting perhaps the bickering between Jacob's two wives that we find all the way back in chapter 30. At this time, if we do the math, by the time that Shelah grows up and he has this incident with Tamar, Judah is probably in his mid-40s. With the impression that he's just kind of sick of it all. Sick of life. Sick of dealing with all this mess. He doesn't know what to do. But in this chapter, we see that he can't run from himself. He can't run from the unfaithfulness to the promises that he's made. He can't run from his own sexual liaisons. He can't run from the manipulation of circumstances in his favor that he continues to try to play out. He can't run from his own hypocrisy, claiming to live one way and then condemning those who live the way he actually does. And the worst of it is, Judah is a part of God's covenant people, God's family, the family that Tamar now is stuck with. And we look at all of this and we think about the promise that God made to Abraham just a couple of generations before in chapter 12. Abraham, I'm going to use your family to bless all the nations of the world. And we look at Judah and we think, how in the world is God going to keep his promise through people like Judah? How can they be a blessing to the entire world? Disillusioned, desperate. Those, I think, are emotions that we find in this chapter, and I think those are words that resonate with at least some of us here this morning. Maybe not all the time, maybe not over everything, but words that we say, yes, I've been there, I know that. Maybe I'm even there right now. And there are a lot of things, of course, that could leave us disillusioned. We could talk about the state of the world or the state of the country. We could talk about the condition of our health. We could talk about finances. We could talk about circumstances at work. But many times we find, like in this text, that God's people are disillusioned with things in their family and at church. In other words, the very people who ought to be the greatest sources of strength and encouragement in our lives, who could point us toward the love and the faithfulness of a covenant God. Those are the people who are the greatest cause of pain and heartache. I remember hearing a story one time about two church members, one who criticized another's business practices at a time when, unbeknownst to the critic, it was an especially vulnerable time in this man's business, and so he took it very personally. And even though they continue to worship together, they're stuck in the same pews week after week, barely able to look at each other or shake each other's hands. And we think, how can God redeem situations like this where we're disillusioned with the people that we're sitting side by side with, that we're sitting around tables with, that we're working with in community? We can grow disillusioned with the sins of our parents, the betrayals of a spouse, the offenses of our children, the rivalries among siblings. Our fellow church members can bicker and criticize and twist our words and fail to follow through on promises. They can stick us with extra work, or maybe they can hoard all the important decisions for themselves. No, not always. By God's grace, there are plenty of examples of, I think, good family situations and good relationships among people in this church. But sometimes we're let down by each other. Sometimes, like Tamar, we are the victims of other people's sins. Sometimes, like Judah, we run from our own sins and try not to even see that they're there. And more often, there's a little bit of both of us, both in us. That we are good at magnifying the sins that have been done to us, but much less able to see what's in our own hearts. And so we ask ourselves, how in the world can God redeem our story? How can he use this husband or wife, this brother or sister, this church to highlight his work of salvation? and to bless the world. And yet what we find is this sordid story is one of the few that Matthew picks out in his genealogy when he gives us the background of Jesus' birth. And that alone ought to prompt us to look more closely to see what is God doing here. And that might be a little difficult because if we read through the text, God is barely mentioned in chapter 38. But I think as we know, maybe from our own stories, from our own experiences, just because God is not mentioned explicitly doesn't mean that he's not there. So where is God? Well, first, I just want to briefly suggest what the point of the story is not, because sometimes this story gets pulled out as an example and used in discussions about birth control or about prostitution. And while the Bible does have principles that guide the use of birth control, the Bible speaks clearly about the evils of prostitution, this chapter is not the place where we locate our entire theology of either one. I think sometimes there's a legalistic tendency to pick a passage like this and see it as primarily addressing maybe it's a failure to fulfill family obligations. Or in our cancel culture, we pull out this story and we say, look at Judah. He's an example of an irredeemable failure of a man. But neither approach gets to the heart of what God may be doing by including this story in Scripture and in the Savior's genealogy. And so we want to dig a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, what is actually going on in this story? And I think if we want to find the key verse in this story, if we want to find the key verse that begins to unlock all the disillusionment that we find here and bring redemption, we have to go to verse 26, Judah's words. She is more righteous than I. Now, that doesn't mean that Judah or God view Tamar's actions as morally right. God is not urging us to justify sexual sin because of the circumstances. Sex outside the covenant of marriage is always outside the bounds of God's intention for us. But what Judah here is doing is recognizing that all sin has a context. And in order to address sin, at least if we want to address sin the way that God addresses sin, we also have to not only see the surface and see what is done or not done, but we have to understand the context of the human heart. It was a good reminder, I think, in a world where we're often uncomfortable talking about sin, to remember that sin has both those dimensions. That it's not simply a finger pointing and saying, you did this or you didn't do that, or look at those bad people over there. And it's not just either, well, look at the intentions of the heart, because the actions do matter. We have to include both. What we see in this story is that in its own strange way, Tamar's action was faithful to the family she'd been stuck with. I mean, Tamar could have run off and found another man. Now, it would have been difficult in that society. We can see that in Judah's reaction in verse 24, right? That there was a kind of a claim on Tamar that made it hard for her to make that choice. But she could have run away somehow. But she didn't. She did the honorable thing in a way by sticking to her commitment to be part of the family she hadn't chosen, by bearing offspring for Judah and not some other man. Realizing that led Judah to shift from angry condemnation of Tamar in verse 24 to a kind of respectful acceptance of her faithfulness to him in verse 26. And God graciously does allow Tamar to bear not one, but two sons who would go on to be leaders among God's people. And Judah? Well, one of the things that we see in the last third of the book of Genesis is the development of Judah's character. See, up until verse 26, if we're thinking about God's promise to bless the world through Abraham's descendants, we have to be pretty disillusioned. Jacob may be the chosen heir, but he's not a very nice guy if you look at him in Scripture. And his family is a total mess. We look at Judah, one of the examples of Jacob's family, and all that we can see is how far, how low God's chosen people can sink. You know, as an aside, I was thinking about the Canons of Dort here recently, and in the 5th section of the Canons of Dort, there's an article that talks about how even believers can fall into serious sin, and sometimes we do fall into serious sin. And I think about Judah's story in light of that and think there's a warning and an example to all of us there that we can't tell ourselves, well, I'm above ever doing something like that. See, to put it in today's terms, if Jacob's family is the church, Judah is one of its most prominent representatives, and yet he's a scoundrel. He's someone willing to be hypocritical and condemning of sin in others. And it's no wonder that people dislike the church when they see people like Judah as its representatives. But something happens in this text. Something happens to Judah when Tamar returns a seal and cord and staff in verse 25. For the first time, Judah sees. Remember, he was at a Nahum when this happened? Nahum, this word means eyes. For the first time, his eyes are opened. And he sees himself. He sees his failings. Now, maybe we could say he doesn't quite own his role in Tamar's situation as thoroughly as we would like by today's standards. But for the first time in the story, he offers grace. And the next time we find Judah in the text, which can't have been too much longer after this story, again doing the math, maybe a couple of years at the most. In chapter 43, he is a remarkably different person. He's measured, he's responsible, he's ultimately much more repentant and aware of the need both for grace for himself and for his extended family. And by the time he's in chapter 44, when he is the representative of Jacob's family before the man he doesn't know yet is his youngest brother, Joseph. We find Judah being the one to say, you know what, give the blame to me. I will take the hit so that others can flourish. A total shift in his character. It's as if something clicked in this sorry story that makes him understand what it means to be a child of God, what it means to be a son of the covenant and a member of God's people. That he is accepted by grace, that he is redeemed by God's mercy, that he, like Tamar, has been welcomed into the family, not because of what they've done, but because of God's love. Everything that the Messiah would come to do. See, if part of this reason Matthew shares a story in his genealogy is to help us understand who Jesus is, then there's a lot of hope for us in this story. For Jesus, even more than Tamar, chose to join this family. I mean, Jesus was in heaven, right? He's in bliss. He's in glory. He didn't have to pick this family of all the families on earth to join. He could have chosen to associate himself only with holy rollers or goody two-shoes. But instead he comes to a family that has its share of messes. In other words, it was God's plan all along to join this group, to associate himself with Canaanites and scoundrels and desperate women and disillusioned children, and to bring them all under his reign as king. Jesus, Matthew reminds us, is the Savior who is like us in every way, but without sin, who comes into our story in order to open our eyes to who we really are, in order then to change us by his grace and by his Spirit into all that God calls us to be. I want to close this morning with a few brief words to those who maybe find yourselves disillusioned, or perhaps even desperate because you're stuck in a story that seems like it has no redemption. First of all, I want to encourage you to hang in there. Maybe Tamar and her culture didn't have as much agency as we do. But there is a real sense in which she makes a choice in this story. She's portrayed as making a choice to stick with a dysfunctional family and to say, this is my people, whether I like it or not. And so whether it's your literal family or whether it's your church family or whether it's the church family more broadly that frustrate and fail you, I want to encourage you to know that there is grace in sticking with the people God gives you. That's not to say you don't confront sin when it's there. We can confront sin. We don't just sweep it under the rug and pretend that it doesn't exist or that it doesn't fracture the relationships that we're in. But there are ways to confront sin with a desire to restore relationship and to make the mercy of God the thing that is seen. And I think it's important to say we need to hang in there with things because everything in our culture tells us that we're crazy for doing that. That really it's about us. It's about our flourishing. It's about me and how I feel. And so if a relationship that I'm in doesn't make me feel good, I should get out. this marriage, this church, this family. Just run away from it. But over and over in the Bible, we see that God has a purpose for us in community. That we are called to stick with each other just as he stuck with us. He stuck with me. He stuck with you. So hang in there. Second, know that you can't run from yourself, from your own sins. This is, I think, is especially for the Judas around us. Maybe the Judah within us. Judah might have been able to keep God far from his thoughts during this, whatever it is, 20-year period. While his sons are growing up. At least until he had to recognize Tamar's righteousness. But we see here that God is never far from his story. Now, the only mention we get of God is behind the scenes in the deaths of Judah's oldest sons in verses 7 and 10. But we get the sense that in retrospect, Judah is able to see just how much God kept pursuing him, whether it's in judgment or in grace. And sometimes what we feel like is judgment at the moment may actually be grace. Because it's God's way of kind of stopping us in our tracks and getting our attention and trying to say, you need something to change. See, sooner or later, whether it's in this life or whether it's before God's throne, you and I are going to have to come to terms with our own shortcomings and our own hurts and our own sins and what we did with that. And that's why those things are named in Jesus' genealogy, to say that they are a part of our story. They are a part of the story of the people that Jesus came to redeem. These sins and these shortcomings and these hurts and these being sinned against. All of that is part of the story that we take to our Savior. And third, we see not only that we can stick in there, hang in there, know that we can't run from our sins, but we also see that God has the ability to redeem the biggest mess. If Tamar, a desperate foreigner who everyone just tried to push off to the side and pretend that she didn't have rights, that she didn't exist. If Judah, who was an immoral and selfish member of God's family who didn't realize what he had been given, if these people can be redeemed and have their stories drawn into the story of a Savior, then so can our stories. So can we. So can I. Now I realize that many people in our world today are disillusioned because our stories are a mess. And yes, there's those instances of grace, and we want to keep those in front of us too throughout this series, and we'll see some of them. But I think the reality that we have to reckon with in Advent is one in part too that calls us to repentance, to recognize the depth of our need for a Savior. And so we realize that sometimes our families are more like Judah's than we'd like to admit, that our churches may resemble his families in ways we would prefer to ignore or cover up. Our lives may reflect a lot more of Tamar's desperation or Judah's selfish ambitions, more than we want to acknowledge. But the promise that runs through Scripture is always that a Messiah, a Savior, is coming. He's going to come to such people, and he's going to come out of the midst of such people. And so God encourages us, keep holding on, even if it's in disillusion or even desperation. And then prepare to have your eyes opened. Open to the work God is doing to redeem your story, our story, with the gift of Jesus and his perfect righteousness. Let's pray.